Okay, let's get started. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Good to see you all. So today, we're going to continue our discussion. We talked a lot last week about the conquest narratives. Bad timing for the flow of the class to talk about blood and violence and gore right at Christmas time, but it is what it is. Just a few things for those who weren't here last week, or if you've forgotten, or if you thought about it over the week, that I just want to keep driving home. This was extraordinarily, because these stories are very difficult and challenging and in many cases horrific. So I just want to keep driving this home, and because this was very helpful to me from my professor. I'm not saying that this is what God said. I'm saying this is what the Israelites said that God said. And you can take that as another correlation. I'm not saying that this is actually what happened. What we're saying is that this is what the ancient Israelites said happened. So I think that's important because we have to, I don't think it's proper or appropriate to just ignore chunks of the Bible. We have this tradition, we have this book, and we have to kind of deal with all of it, and some of it is easy, the love your neighbor and turn the other cheek, all that stuff, and God, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, that stuff is easy and everybody likes that part. But what about the difficult parts? So we have to be able to sort it all out and rack and stack it and figure it out. So I think it's important to think about these kind of things as we go forward. And just again, a quick recap, what's heavy in this is retributional theology. It's kind of the backbone of what Deuteronomy is based on. It's what Deuteronomy says, they're kind of, hey, Jen, it's kind of the whole mindset of this part of the Bible is that if you do good things and do the proper things, God will bless you. If you don't do good things and you don't do the proper worship things, then God will be angry at you, and you will be punished for that. So it's clearly the mindset, and you can see that in the whole. I think I mentioned last week the prosperity gospel that we hear today. If you skip class and flick and watch TV and watch Joel Osteen or any of the others. Joel Osteen's probably the most tame of them all. Some of the other ones are much more flamboyant with it, but it's very much, if you follow God, and following God means sending them some money, then you will be blessed, and whatever you contribute to the ministry will be given back to you tenfold, 100-fold. And if it's not, then that's because you sinned. You've got some unconfessed sin in your life, this is what they say, and you need to get that all straightened out. I don't particularly buy that line of reasoning, but it clearly comes from this section of the Bible, because that's the main theology going on in the background. And then we talked about prescription, and we're going to talk about that more today. And this is a word that you see in the Bible, and I went back through and looked at a bunch of different versions, and they all use prescribed, banned, harem, and there are these words that we don't use very much. Normal people don't use very much. I don't know if they pick those words if they're kind of scholarly words, or but because we don't really know what they mean, it's easy to just kind of gloss over it. Oh, the city was prescribed. Okay, well, but what does that actually mean? And what it means is that it's given to God as a sacrifice, and that everything, all the people, all the things, all the animal, are to be completely destroyed. Just like you would take a sacrifice and burn it on the altar in old times, that's what prescription is on a big scale when you go into battle or war, holy war. So it's not unique to ancient Israel, I mean, a lot of other ancient civilizations followed that same mindset. So it was very common in the ancient Near East. I mean, shoot, it's common even today. I mean, we have Geneva Conventions, but we always talk about war crimes. All of these are, what we would call today war crimes, Okay, so we went through a long bit in the text, and I want to spend a little bit more time kind of driving home some of the things in Joshua. But we talked about the Battle of Jericho and the spies who went right to Jericho and they hung out with the prostitute because of course they did, and why would you not? And everybody was destroyed in Jericho except for Rahab, the prostitute, because she supported the spies. And so then we get to the story of Achan. And Achan is one of the Israelite warriors. The Israelites, during the Battle of Jericho, the Israelites violated the prescription of Jericho. Achan of the tribe of Judah took that which was prescribed, and the Lord was incensed. So Achan didn't destroy everything. Achan took some money and kept it for himself. So the Israelites went into another battle. They couldn't win the battle. Everybody was upset. God comes to Joshua and says, dude, you didn't win because you're not following the rules. Someone didn't follow the rules of prescription. So Joshua had all of Israel come forward by tribes, and the tribe of Judah was indicated. What does this mean? Indicated. In the ancient world, when they had to figure stuff out that they didn't know, they basically used a system of casting lots or throwing dice, and that God would guide the decision-making process. This is very common when we get after the new year. In the new year, we'll get to the monarchy, and when they chose Saul as the king, it was by casting lots. In the New Testament, you remember Judas betrays Jesus, kills himself in one gospel, vanishes in another gospel. But in the Acts of the Apostle, the book of Acts, the apostles are like, well, Jesus is gone, we need a new guy. And so they cast lots, and the lots fell to Bartholomew. And so Bartholomew, who I guess was a guy who kind of wasn't part of the inner circle of Jesus, but kind of traveled around with them, became part of the inner circle. So this is a kind of a way to do this. So they're casting lots. They come up with Judah was the one who was the problem, and then they narrow it down to the clans and then to the houses. And then they finally get to Achan, who unfortunately is a relative of Joshua. That makes it even more difficult, because it's easy if it was somebody else from another tribe, and it's like, you guys are always screwing everything up. But for Joshua, it's like his own people are the ones who violated the prescription. So Joshua says to Achan, my son, pay honor to the Lord and make confession to him. Tell me what you've done and do not hold anything back. So Achan says, it's true, I've sinned against the Lord. This is what I did. I saw among the spoil a fine Shinar mantle, like a cloak, 200 shekels of silver and a wedge of gold, and I coveted them and I took them, and they're buried in the ground under my tent. So that's bad. So Joshua took Achan along, and they got all the silver and the gold and all this stuff, and they bring Achan and his sons and his daughters and his ox and his ass and his flocks and his tent and everything to the valley of Achor. And you can guess what happens. And Joshua says, what calamity you have brought upon us, Yahweh will bring calamity upon you this day. And all Israel pelted them with stones. They put them to the fire, and they stoned them, and the anger of the Lord was subsided. They destroyed everything in this story. Achan, who did it, and his entire family and all of his possessions. Harem is a big deal. But fortunately, so right after poor Achan gets stoned and put to fire, gets killed, and all his family, the Lord says to Joshua, they're talking about the next city they have to go fight against, the city of Ai. And he says, see, I will deliver the king of Ai and his people and his city into your hands, and treat them just as you treated Jericho and her king. However, you may now keep the spoil and the cattle as booty for yourselves. It's like, well, what happened for poor Achan? That's convenient. Now they can keep all of the stuff for themselves, so they don't have to destroy it all. So you can see kind of a, difference here. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, it's okay to keep some of this stuff. Why? Because they, in ancient battles, you kept the spoils of war. That was your reward as a soldier. If you survived the battle, that's how you got paid. They didn't pay you. The king didn't pay you to go be a soldier. The king just made you go be a soldier, but you got to keep stuff that you found. So they go into battle with the city of Ai, with the warriors of Ai. Ai is a Canaanite city just north of where Jerusalem is. And the Lord said to Joshua, hold out the javelin in your hand toward Ai, for I will deliver it into your hands. And we talked last week about the Mosesification of Joshua, where they try, in the book of Joshua, they try to make Joshua be like Moses. And you remember the story of Moses. He had to hold his staff up and hold his arms up in order for the Israelites to win the battle. This is a similar kind of story. Joshua has to hold out his spear to keep it, to make sure that the battle goes well. So Joshua held out the javelin in his hand toward the city and did not draw his hand until all the inhabitants of Ai had been exterminated. And Joshua burned down Ai and turned it into a mound of ruins, and the king of Ai was impaled on the stake. Complete annihilation. So we keep seeing this over and over. The Amorite kings. This is the story of where Joshua, they're fighting the Amorites, which is another Canaanite group, another group of tribes, 5 kings banded together. And the Israelites can't, the battle's going on, and they can't seem to win it. And so they chase them out. And as they chase them out, the Lord a hailstorm comes and is pelting them with hailstones, and huge stones came from the sky, and more perished from the hail than were killed by the Israelite weapons. And when the Lord routed the Amorites, the sun halted in the sky and did not press on to set for a whole day. For the Lord fought for Israel. Neither before nor since has there ever been such a day. So there were so many Amorites, and so great was the victory that God had to stop the sun from moving through the sky in order to finish the battle and to wipe them all out. Lots of fantastical stories, very mythological. You can see that in here. And then you go through the list of all the cities, and you can see it here in bold. They prescribe it, and every person in it, and no one escaped. City after city, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, everyone gets put to the sword. From Lachish, they went to Eglon. From Eglon, they went to Hebron. And thus, Joshua conquered the whole country, the hill country, the Negeb, the Shephelah, the slopes, and all their kings. He let none escape, but prescribed everything that breathed, as Yahweh, the God of Israel, had commanded. And I think that piece is really important for us as we try to get our heads around this, is it's not just a recounting of how ancient warfare, it was brutal. I mean, warfare in any time is brutal. Talk to anybody who was in Afghanistan or Iraq. I met some folks who fought just, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and it's brutal. It's brutal. It's not just that. What the Bible is saying is this is what God commanded. This is what God wanted. Did I say Merry Christmas? Merry Christmas.
So the one, I can't remember the name, but where they were allowed to keep the spoils.
Yes.
And that one's at odds with everything else, it seems. Is there any thoughts about why that one was made an exception?
I think the reason why they were not allowed to keep the spoils before is that was typically how you did it. Everything was devoted to God. But there was probably history, tradition, especially in the time of the monarchy, when a lot of these things may have started to be written down. When you went to battle, you kept the spoils. And so they had to kind of clean up the story of how, we have this story of poor Achan, and he got killed for keeping stuff away. And that's a traditional story, but today we go and we keep all the booty ourselves. So what changed? And so it's a point in the text where they can kind of say, hey, God had a change of heart. And so what we're doing today now is okay,
And then like the ones you talked about subsequently, are they chronologically later? Like why didn't they go back
in the story?
one out of like
Oh no. In the story, they're all kind of chronological, and from that point after Jericho on, they're allowed to keep the booty. So they can keep the money and they can keep the animals. They just have to kill all the people.
Seems like the difference was that Achan was being shamed for, and his whole family was being persecuted
Right.
for his actions.
Yeah.
And the other scenario seems very different in that they were just fighting a war, okay?
Right.
And the spoils go to the victor of a war. So I think that to me is why there seems to be a difference.
It could be that too, is that he directly violated
Yeah, he was
what.
being shamed.
Right. That's very possible as well. Some of this is just trying for us to have to try to, it's us trying to interpret an ancient culture and a bunch of traditions and different sources that got woven together into a final story. And it's hard to kind of say exactly what all went into their thinking on that. So it's a thread of a story, perhaps shame, perhaps just changing of practices, and they needed a transition point to be able to say, hey, now it's okay to do this. So I think all of those are very plausible. Okay, so that's what Joshua says. So the question is that really what happened? And so we want to talk about archaeology and history. Of course, we don't have any history, we don't have any contemporaneous archaeological evidence in the form of a text or, Canaanite king saying this is what happened. All we have the book of Joshua, but we don't have to go very far because the book right after Joshua is Judges. And Judges gives us a very significantly different picture, and it's arranged in the text to make it seem like first there was Joshua and the invasion, and then the time of the Judges. But most scholars view these as two different interpretations, that the Judges is maybe a bit more historical, because rather than being this unified army going into to conquer the land, it's a group of tribes, and as emergencies and crises come up, a warrior, a warlord, somebody rises up to lead the people to fight back the battle. Then they kind of go back to just doing things by their tribes, and then so it's a very decentralized tribal society that gets described in there. In Joshua, the conquest it's like a blitzkrieg. They come in and they just drive through the country and they capture everything within a relatively short period of time. In Judges, the settlement of the land is very fragmented. It's incomplete. And there's a lot of Canaanite cities. In Joshua conquers everything. In Judges, there's always Canaanite cities and Canaanite kings who are causing problems for the people of Israel. So, like I said, most scholars think that Judges preserves kind of an older, more historically plausible origin story of Israel, and that the Joshua story is maybe more of a idealized, newer version, which we'll talk about next week. So we can just take a look at it. In Joshua, they go through a whole list of cities. Joshua goes and conquers, kills the king of Jerusalem, which implies that when you kill the king, you've conquered the city. But in Judges, throughout Judges, it stays, Jerusalem is in the hands of the Jebusites. It's not an Israelite city. And it's not until the time of David, the story is in David, when David goes and conquers Jerusalem to become the capital of Israel. There's a whole bunch of other cities that get listed. And in Joshua, they get clearly, the text clearly says they were defeated. But then when you get to the book of Judges, the Canaanites are still there. They're still living there. So it's like there's a little bit, even within the Bible, of some incongruities and some inconsistencies. So then we can start talking a little bit about archaeology. So let's start with, since we started the story in Joshua with Jericho, we'll start the archaeology with Jericho. And Jericho is a place that had been excavated a number of times throughout history. And the history of archaeology it's not a clear path. It started in what was called antiquarians. Basically, people looking for stuff, kind of the traditional Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones is not really an archaeologist. He's a treasure hunter, right? He's always going to find the Ark and the Holy Grail, and he's looking for stuff to put into the museum. And that's how things were in the 1800s, 1800s, is people would go, they started getting really interested in, hey, there's all this old stuff, let's go and get it. That's why everything's in the British Museum, right? They all go and dig it up and take it back to London and look at it and put it on display. But they didn't really understand. It wasn't really they weren't really interested in trying to find out how, I mean, some people were, but as a profession, it was more kind of finding cool stuff in the desert versus trying to understand how people lived and what was going on, that, how understanding the chronology, so in the 1800s, they go to and they do some excavations around Jericho, and they get down to this layer, and there's what's called a burn layer or a destruction layer. And they're like, look, beneath this burn layer is these massive city walls, and then there's this destruction layer. That's what happened in the book of Joshua. So now we have proof of this. But Kathleen Kenyon, one of the leading British archaeologists of her age, she grew up, her father was a biblical scholar and worked at the British Museum. The house they lived in was on the grounds of the British Museum. So she literally grew up in the British Museum. She becomes an archaeologist. Some family friends said, you should go to school and learn about archaeology, and she did. And so she actually was one of the pioneers of what's called the stratigraphic method, which is, archaeology today. You start at the top and you slowly work your way down in layers, and you catalog everything, and you see how things change vertically instead of just digging a hole looking for stuff. And what she found, at Jericho was while she found the same things, the chronology and the timeline that she came up with was significantly different. What she found is in the early Bronze Age, which was well before any Exodus story. The Exodus story, remember we were talking about, if it happened, when would it have happened? It would happen somewhere between 1200 and 1400 BCE. So almost 1500 years before that. Jericho was a major fortified city, huge walls. It's been there forever. It's the equivalent, I think, if somebody was 1,000 years from now going to, say, Paris, London, they've been there for a really long time. Rome, they dig up Rome and they're like, oh, this city has been here for thousands of years. And then, as she kind of worked through the layers, in the Middle Bronze Age, which is roughly 2000 to 1500 BCE, 1550, it was again a heavily fortified city. But this burn and destruction layer was pretty clearly associated with the Middle Bronze Age, around 1500 BCE. And remember that when they date these things, they're looking at things like, she was looking primarily at pottery because they didn't really even have carbon-14 dating as much at that time. Today, they can use the carbon-14 dating on things like seeds and olive pits, and there's some debris that they find, and they can go back and see how long ago that was there. Looking at pottery, how many of y'all have pottery or in your house? How many of you have pottery from your grandparents? Maybe some, yeah.
I was married to a potter.
Yeah, so there you go. And so it's you can't get, this pot's from, if you come in and say this puts it in 1957, well, maybe, just from the pot itself, but you can kind of look at style, and then you may say, people save pottery and they don't just chunk it out all the time. It's not, what I'm saying is not exact science, but it can get you within 100 years or so, right? So if you're trying to slice the bologna, as my professor used to say, really thin and get down to, okay, was the city destroyed in 1550 or 1551 or 1549? You can't get that accurate. But it was clearly destroyed before any plausible Exodus or Joshua campaign could have occurred.
Do we know who started the pottery exploration?
It was before her. I mean, it started to be even in the late 1800s. And like I said, it wasn't a shift, but they were starting, you had the treasure huntery kind of archaeologists, and then you had the people who were trying to date stuff. And that's where they started. They could look at things, and they knew that certain places, certain excavations had other dating, like a stele associated with it, or some other inscription associated with it. So they're like, this kind of pottery is at this location over here, and we know it dates to about this time, and we can also do that now with carbon-14 dating even more accurately. And then we find that same pottery over here, that correlation would suggest that this is about the same age as this other place over here. So they were doing that before her. She was one of the leaders in really using that technique to really, along with this, going through the strata, to really fine tune her expectation.
You can also tell the people that are researching it where the clay comes from.
Correct, right.
That's a very identifying
Right.
factor. And you can trace the technology of kilns where the pottery was fired.
Right.
And that makes a difference. There's a famous
Right.
potter from Jacksonville called Charlie Brown, and his work is now in the Smithsonian. And he dug his clay from the banks of the St. John's River.
Ah,
So it's a very definitive
right.
period of time and source of clay.
Source of clay.
That's, and he did raku, which
Yeah.
is a different kind of firing.
Right,
So it's
right.
fascinating study.
Yeah, you can see the differences, and we'll talk in the new year when we're going to talk about, where we think origins of Israel really were, and that really begins to see, because the pottery of the ancient Israelites is very similar to Canaanite pottery, but it's much more utilitarian. It's not as decorated, it's not as fancy, it's more utilitarian, but it follows the same basic shapes and same basic pottery making styles and techniques.
The wheel started.
I don't know.
Google that.
Yeah,
But that made a difference too. In terms
Right.
of the style. It was either hand built forever.
Right.
Okay. Until the wheel came along.
Right.
To throw with the wheel. It's a very different style.
Right.
Most cultures have different designs also in their pottery.
Correct. And that's another way to kind of
Even if you have a fragment.
So exactly. So while it's pretty good. It's not 100% definitive, but it's pretty good. And honestly, all these things that we're talking about, are probabilities, right? We can't say, nobody knows for certain when Jericho was destroyed and what was the cause of that destruction, but we can, through these different techniques, we can get, it's more probable that this destruction of Jericho occurred from the Egyptians at the end of the Hyksos. So remember we talked about the Hyksos, who were the Semitic kings of Egypt, who were had kind of taken over the country, and they got driven out at about this time, and Egypt, so Egypt started to grow again into another major superpower again. So it may be more related to the Egyptians kind of coming up and fighting with the Hyksos than it was with Israelites coming in and fighting with Canaanites.
Was that their middle kingdom, the Egyptians, or the last kingdom?
No, I think,
It's okay.
I can't remember off the top of my head.
I wouldn't have said this, but it says that the first potter's wheel first appeared in Mesopotamia around Iraq at around 3500 BCE.
Yeah, wow. I would have said a lot. I would have said a lot earlier or a lot later than that. Yeah, interesting. The other very interesting result that came from Kenyon's findings was that at the time of the late Bronze Age, so the time when if a conquest story was to take place, hey, how you doing? Come on in. Nope. Oh, you're welcome. No problem. But Jericho, at the time of the conquest, was not a fortified city. So in the old days, the city would get destroyed either by a natural disaster or a war. People would move back in and they just build right on top of the remains and start all over again. It was not like that in this late Bronze Age. And instead, there was pretty clear evidence that it was pretty sparsely populated and for long stretches of time abandoned. So the story of the Battle of Jericho, while interesting and cool and great literature and a great story, doesn't really add up into the archaeological record as having really occurred. Clearly, the city was destroyed, but at a much earlier time. So now let's talk about the Ai. We talked about the city of Ai, right? And Ai was also excavated in the 1930s by a young Israeli architect, Judith Maquette Krauss. I had no idea about this. I was researching it. This woman is fascinating. So if you're really interested, Google her and look around, and what a fascinating person. She died at 30 years old of tuberculosis. So she did all of this. She learned all of this archaeology and was a leader in archaeology and made some major discoveries before she was 30 years old. Tremendous. Anyway, she goes to the city of Ai, which is scholars and historians have kind of narrowed down to the what's called Et Tel. These tells are these big mounds that are all around in Israel and even in Britain. Things that go back. You can see them in the UK, and they go back to prehistoric times. Yeah, and the Celts, and they find all sorts of historic stuff there. So they've identified Et Tel as likely being the city of Ai. It was again, in the early Bronze Age, a massive city, huge fortifications, lots of thick walls. But by the late Bronze Age, it had been abandoned. It had been destroyed and abandoned, and there was nothing going on in the city of Ai. And it was her research and her findings that started in the early 20th century scholars like Martin Note, who's a German scholar, to start saying that really drove some of their thinking on these stories aren't actually history. Before this, all you had was the Bible. You didn't have any archaeological evidence. So it's like, this is a story. Why would we not trust it? But now the science isn't lining up with the story, and they start driving some of these other theories of where did Israel come from? How did the beginnings of the Bible occur? Due to the Second World War and a lot of stuff after Judith's death in 1936, it kind of sat vacant until the early 60s, when it was excavated again by an American archaeologist named Joseph Calloway. And he was with one group. He ended up teaching and retiring at the end of his career at the University of Chicago. But basically, his findings from his excavations at the city of Ai confirmed everything that Marquette Krauss had found. And he concluded that the city was destroyed around 2200 BCE and remained abandoned throughout the Middle and Late Bronze Ages. And his conclusion, built on her work, was that there was no way that the city of Ai could have been a fortified city at the time of any kind of conquest. So now you have the history, the biblical books don't necessarily align when you look at them. The archaeology of two of the major battles, the battles that get the most space in Joshua, don't align at well. The historicity of the conquest is very much in question. However, I want to say one last thing. There's another city, because it's not a clear picture, but the city of Hatzor. It's mentioned in Joshua, where they go in and they destroy it. Same kind of story. There's not a long story. It's just kind of a note off of it. Hey, this was destroyed. And it was excavated by another Israeli architect or archaeologist, Yadel Yadin, back in the late 50s. And but different from Jericho and Ai, Hatzor was populated at during the long. It was populated, and it was a Canaanite city, populated and lived in the late Bronze Age, and it was destroyed right around the time a conquest would have occurred. So a lot of very conservative apologists and scholars, because scholars have opinions too, right? And so that you can have the whole gamut. You can have scholars who look at the evidence and come up with, this is all just imaginative stories, and other scholars who look at it and say, oh no, the archaeology affirms everything that was in the Bible. They will often point to Hatzor as the proof of the conquest. I think what it does is it doesn't really provide proof of the conquest, but it provides proof that even into the time a conquest would occur, there were battles and wars going on and cities being destroyed. I don't think, the other thing that's interesting is in Joshua, the book of Joshua says Joshua destroyed Hatzor, but in the book of Judges, it's not Joshua, it's a Canaanite city, and Deborah and Barak, remember the story of Deborah and Barak? Or if you don't know the story of Deborah and Barak, go back and read that story in Joshua or in Judges, because it's really great. They're the ones who take out the city of Hatzor. So exactly what happened, it's pretty likely that during the time of the Israelites beginning to live in the land, that there were battles and there were fights, and that there were cities destroyed, and that people were obliterated in the principle of Harem. Those things are probably true statements. But was it all directed by God and done in a big conquest like is told in the story of Joshua? Likely not. And then finally, we talked about this a few weeks ago, but the Merneptah stele It dates back to 1200 and 1208 BCE, erected by Pharaoh Merneptah, and it goes through. Let me back up. It goes through from here all the way down to here, telling about how great Pharaoh Merneptah is. I am awesome, and I came and I destroyed these people, and I destroyed those people, and I destroyed them, and I destroyed them, and they all worship me as a god, and I am awesome, right? Just like any good politician would do even today, right? And then when you get to the very bottom of the stele, there's this little line of hieroglyphics that says, Israel, this has been translated to be, Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. And what this is the first time that Israel is ever mentioned as a people group. It's interesting that the hieroglyphs, I think it's the little bird here, doesn't indicate a city. Like they had different hieroglyphs for cities and kingdoms and nations. This is just kind of like an ethnic group. It's a people group. So Israel is this people group who live in the land, and they have been destroyed by Merneptah. So it's the earliest indication of Israel. It's the earliest indication that they were in the land around 1200 BCE. But that does not seem to indicate that they were a government or an empire or a country, or that they had, and that tends to kind of fit in with the book of Judges, where you have a very tribal type of community where people live, they're living in the land in a loose coalition, but they're not living in fortified cities with a king and all of that kind of stuff. So I want to skip over here. I decided not to put this in, but I think I want to talk about this real quick. And we have just a few minutes. So this is our timeline, and we had a few weeks ago, the early dating of an Exodus story, the late dating of an Exodus story. The late dating, if there was an Exodus, which most scholars don't think there was, the evidence doesn't support it, would mean that there was the conquest would be here around 1200. And while we have a record of Israel being in the land, there doesn't seem to be evidence for much of a conquest at that same time. Prior to 1200, remember that Egypt was the predominant power. And they had control of all of Israel all the way up into Syria at that time. And there is nothing in the Egyptian records up to around 1300 to suggest that there was any kind of conquest, that this land was anything other than just a vassal state for Egyptian power. So Canaanite cities, but Egypt was in control. Around 1200, there is what's known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. And documented throughout the ancient world, Greece all the way up into here, the Hittites, through Babylon and Assyria and Persia, Egypt, and including Canaan, city-states, old structures started to fall apart. It's documented everywhere, but nobody really knows why. It's been speculated that it could be invaders from somewhere else, although there doesn't seem to be any strong evidence for that. It could be a global famine. There could be some ecological reason going on, climate change. I don't know what it was. But for some reason, around 1200, everything kind of started, civilization as we kind of knew it, or as the people then knew it, started to fall apart. Egypt fell back into their more traditional timeframes. This is after Merneptah. So Merneptah is coming through right before this great collapse occurs. But then right after him, things start falling apart. The Sea Peoples, we haven't really talked about Sea Peoples, but you remember the stories. We will be talking about them a lot after the new year, because everybody knows the Philistines, right? The Philistines fought with David, and they're an integral part. They're kind of these Sea Peoples, and they moved in, people think, from Phoenicia coming in, and there's lots of documents of the Egyptians fighting with the Sea People as they try to establish a foothold here. Scholars think that they're coming in, trying problems at home, so they're finding a new place to live. This is a pretty fertile area. They try to come in and land, and they establish a toehold down here in the south part of the southwest part, sorry, of Israel. The other speculation is that the Canaanite city-states also started falling apart about this time, which describes what happens at Hatzor. Hatzor could have been an attack from somewhere else. It could have been an internal rebellion of some sort, where class uprisings are occurring and people seem to drive apart. What it created was a big vacuum here in the Levant that allowed the hill country people, the Israelites, to kind of get a foothold, because the empires were all pulled back into their kind of historic areas. They weren't outreaching, and it allowed them some opportunity to kind of grow. And the traditional rulers of Canaan, the Canaanites, were having their own problems, and it made it possible for the Israelites to kind of come in. And we'll talk more about that coming up. So just to give you a little bit of big picture about that, let me go back and say, this was one of the most burning questions that I personally had when I read these during my Old Testament class. Archaeology seems to indicate that, like the Exodus, the biblical conquest of Canaan never actually occurred. Scholars affirm that there's clearly some memory of historic battles, but the book of Judges kind of fits the archaeological record better, and that the book of Joshua is a later retelling of how they ended up in the land. But here's my question. If it never happened, why are they so explicit that their God told them to go in and exterminate everybody? That's what really sat raw with me. It's one thing to say, oh, there were these people and we had these battles and we won. Yay, and now we have the land of Israel. Hooray. I get that. But why do you write into your story that God told you to go and obliterate everyone when you knew it didn't happen? Again, there were plenty of empires. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, they were known for their brutality and warfare. They would go in and they would obliterate cities, and it happened. So it makes sense for them. They're like, this is what we do all the time. We're going to come in, invade, and we'll obliterate it. It makes sense that it's part of their history. But if you're writing a mythological or a story of your history, why do you put that in? And how do we deal with that theologically? So I'm going to leave you with that question, because that's what I really want to talk about next week, is get y'all's thoughts on that. I won't talk as much next week because I really want to hear what you guys think about that. I struggle with it. I struggle with it today. There are days when I wake up and I'm happy to be a Christian and I love God and I'm like, this is great. And there are other days when I wake up thinking about stuff like this and it's like hard to even admit to anyone that I'm part of a religion with this kind of past. How do we deal with that? And how we deal with it is really important. I heard one scholar talking on this subject, and he said, here's the problem with this, is we know these stories are not likely to have happened, but they're being written from an oppressed person's point of view, an oppressed culture. So if you teaser, if you're thinking about Israel at the time of the exile, the Babylonian exile, everything has been destroyed. They've been destroyed. Their temple has been destroyed. They're writing from an oppressed position, looking back, saying, I wish we had done this. This is what we should be doing to our oppressors. But when you take an oppressed person's view of history and an empire takes it, the people who are in control, who are doing the oppressing, bad things really happen. And you can see that throughout history. The Crusades, the settlement of America, the settlement of the New World, not even just America, but Columbus and when the Europeans came over. There is a long history of brutality and murder in the name of Jesus. So think about this week, and I look forward to hearing what you guys maybe think about it next week. And I'll try to have a little more happier stuff to end up on before we go to Christmas. All right, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it.